A heart attack can be the most useful thing that ever happens to an intelligence agency. Not because of what it ends, because of what it opens. In the spring of 2003, a man died in a private clinic in the Beirut neighborhood of Hamra. No shots fired, no Israeli operation in progress, no asset who had been tracking him that night. He had walked into the clinic complaining of chest pain, and somewhere between the intake form and the second hour of observation, his heart stopped. His name inside Israeli intelligence files was Tariq. He was a senior logistics coordinator for Hezbollah. Not the kind of figure who appears in newspaper headlines, but exactly the kind of figure who keeps the organization functional. The man who ensures that weapons move when they need to move, that money reaches the right account, that people who need to disappear from one city appear in another without a traceable gap in the record. Mossad had been building a file on Tariq for 4 years, 4 years of surveillance, 4 years of source cultivation, 4 years of intercepted communications, followed vehicles, mapped associations, and documented meetings in restaurants he would visit twice and then abandon. And in 4 years they had never once been able to answer the simplest question in intelligence work. Where does he sleep? Not his registered address, that was a cousin's apartment he used as a mailing point. Not the safe houses, not the operational locations, not the places where he met with other figures in the network. His actual home. The building he returned to at the end of a day. The door he unlocked when no one else was supposed to be watching. That door was somewhere in Dahieh, the southern suburbs of Beirut, that Hezbollah had turned over decades into something close to a sovereign district, dense, layered, surveilled from within by the organization's own informal network of residents and observers. A place where an unfamiliar face at the wrong intersection was noticed, and where the report traveled faster than the face could walk away. Now Tariq was dead. His body was in a morgue. And within 36 hours, someone was going to carry him home. The question was whether Mossad could follow something no one was going to try to hide. Something for you before we go further, since you clearly cannot get enough of stories like these. Our limited edition ebook covers the operational record of proximity-based collection, the methods, the case failures that refined them, and what separated the operations that produced intelligence from the ones that produced only exposure. Scan the Q, our code on the screen, or click the link in the description. Then stay with us, this story is just getting started. The man assigned to answer that question was not an assassin. He was not a case officer. He did not run agents or authorize operations or make the kind of decisions that appear years later in declassified summaries. He was a technician. His operational designation was Dove. Dove had spent most of his career in signals intelligence before a training injury in the late 1990s ended the physical demands of fieldwork and redirected him into what the agency called technical support, a category broad enough to include everything from debugging communications equipment to engineering the concealment of surveillance devices inside objects that had no obvious reason to contain them. He had hidden trackers in vehicle chassis, in luggage linings, in pieces of consumer electronics. He had once spent 3 days figuring out how to embed a listening device inside a piece of furniture that needed to survive customs inspection in 4 different countries over 18 months. He was precise, methodical, and constitutionally uncomfortable with assumptions he had not tested himself. He received the assignment on a Friday morning, and within an hour he had identified the problem that everyone else in the operation had not yet fully articulated. The device had to go inside the coffin. Not attached to the transport vehicle, the family's vehicle would be swept before entering Dahieh, because Hezbollah's entry protocols for the district included checks for electronic attachments. Not attached to the body would be ritually washed and wrapped in a burial shroud, and anyone performing that preparation would find anything attached to the skin or clothing. It had to go inside the coffin itself, in a way that survived the one thing Dove had never engineered around before: human hands performing an act of care. The ritual preparation of a body for Muslim burial is not a cursory process. It is attentive, complete, and performed by someone whose obligation is to leave nothing undone. The body is handled. The coffin is used if there was anything inside that coffin that did not belong. Any raised surface, any unfamiliar texture, any object that shifted when the body was placed, it would be found. Dove understood this not because he had been briefed on it, but because he had asked the question no one else had thought to ask. Who exactly handles this coffin? And what do their hands do? He spent Friday night building the specification. The device had to be rebuilt from a modified commercial GPS transmitter into a non-metallic polymer shell, no metal, no magnetic signature. The battery needed to support at least 40 hours of operation at a 60-second ping interval. The mounting solution had to adhere to a fabric lining without adhesive residue, without any perceptible raised surface under direct fingertip examination, and without tools. He tested a micro-suction polymer panel against a piece of velvet upholstery fabric at 4 a.m. on Saturday. He pressed it flat and ran his own fingertips over the surface 3 times. He could not feel it. That was the result he needed. That was also the result built on one assumption he had not yet had the opportunity to challenge. He was testing against fabric. The family's coffin, whatever it turned out to be, might not have a fabric lining at all. Dove noted this in his technical brief and kept working. The operation that Dove was preparing for had a history that mattered, because the history explained why something this unusual was being attempted in the first place. Mossad does not improvise casually. When an agency with its resources and track record abandons conventional surveillance methods entirely and builds an operation around a dead man's funeral procession, it is because the conventional methods have been tried, documented, and failed. Specifically, against this specific target repeatedly, Tariq had defeated 4 separate surveillance attempts over 3 years. The methods had varied. A 2-vehicle team lost him in a covered market near the airport road, where he walked in through one entrance and left through a service exit they had not mapped. A 3-vehicle coordinated effort with radio support was identified, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through a report from one member of Tariq's informal observation network that a gray sedan had appeared on 3 separate streets over 40 minutes. He had noted it, altered his route, and never once appeared to react visibly. He simply did not go home that day. The 3rd attempt used an electronic beacon placed on a vehicle associated with his network. It worked for 3 weeks. Then, on the day Tariq was using the vehicle, the driver transferred to a second car near the Kola interchange. The 2nd car had no beacon. The operation ended in a parking structure where the 1st vehicle sat untouched for 2 days. The 4th attempt was the most expensive. A surveillance network built over 18 months, multiple assets, fixed observation points, vehicle coverage across 4 probable departure routes, tracked Tariq through 6 vehicle transfers over 3 hours. Then, the lead analyst noticed the pattern. Tariq was not going anywhere. He was moving through a circuit, walking the surveillance environment, testing whether anyone was maintaining contact through the transitions. He had known, or he had suspected enough to treat the day as a test rather than a route. The controller who had overseen all 4 attempts wrote a single line in his assessment afterward: "We cannot follow a man who expects to be followed." That line had been sitting in a classified file for 14 months when Tariq walked into a clinic in Hamra and did not walk out. What the controller understood, looking at that assessment again on a Friday morning in 2003, was that Tariq's counter-surveillance had one structural limitation that 4 years of operational failure had obscured. It required Tariq to be conscious. A man in motion can anticipate. He can vary his route, transfer his vehicle, audit his environment, identify the team that is following him, and simply choose not to go home while they are watching. He can do all of this because he is awake, he is thinking, and he has spent years developing the specific instincts that this specific threat demands. A man in a coffin cannot do any of those things, and the people carrying him, his family, his network, The men who would organize the procession and select the route and move through Dahye without any awareness that this particular journey was the one time their security protocols were completely irrelevant, they would take him home. Because that is what you do. You take a man home. The tracking device Dove was building needed to survive the preparation room, the procession, and approximately 40 hours of battery operation in a city where Mossad had no safe way to retrieve it. Whether it would survive the one variable Dove had already flagged in his brief, a coffin interior that bore no resemblance to the fabric surface he had tested, was a question that nobody at the authorization level had yet been given the information to answer. That detail was sitting in a technical document that the handler had read and not passed upward. Somewhere in a clinic basement in Hamra, a family was making arrangements. Dove had until Sunday evening. The authorization for Operation Dead Letter was given in a meeting that lasted 47 minutes and left no formal record. Not because the record was destroyed afterward. Because the 4 people in the room understood, without anyone saying it directly, that a written authorization for what they were about to do would create a document whose existence was itself a liability. The controller had been in Israeli intelligence long enough to know the difference between an operation that was sanctioned and an operation that was sanctioned and documented. This was going to be the first kind. The 4 people present were the controller, a senior field handler for the Beirut station, the technical officer who had been brought in to assess feasibility, and a legal review officer, a woman referred to in subsequent internal references only as the advocate, whose presence in meetings of this type was standard procedure, and whose function was not to approve or block, but to ensure that whoever was giving the authorization understood exactly what they were authorizing. The advocate asked one question. She asked it toward the end of the meeting, after the technical assessment had been presented and the operational timeline had been sketched, and the relay infrastructure had been outlined. She waited until the planning language had run its course, until the room had spent 30 minutes talking about ping intervals and mounting surfaces and asset positioning, as though the operation were a logistics problem with a clean solution. Then she asked, what happens to the source if the device is found? The room was quiet for a moment. The controller answered honestly. The source would be exposed. The network would know that the clinic had been penetrated. The access that had taken years to build, not just the single asset inside the preparation room, but the broader intelligence infrastructure that asset's position supported, would be burned. And any intelligence gathered from the operation, however precise, would be unusable, because acting on it would confirm the method by which it had been acquired. The advocate did not respond. She wrote something in a notebook, closed it, and said nothing further. The authorization was given 6 minutes later. What the controller did not say in those 6 minutes, because he was not certain of it himself, was whether the source fully understood what was being asked. The handler had put the question to the asset, "Can you place the device?" The asset had said yes. But the question had been framed around capability, not consequence. The asset knew how to place a device. Whether the asset had been told what would happen to their position inside the network if the placement was ever traced. Whether the informed consent that the advocate's question had gestured toward had actually been extended to the person taking the risk was something the controller had not confirmed before walking into that meeting. He confirmed it afterward. The handler's answer was careful. The asset understood the risk in general terms. The asset's name does not appear in any accessible record. What the debrief summaries establish is the outline, a member of the clinic's administrative staff recruited several years earlier, whose position gave access to patient records and, critically, to the lower-level preparation and storage areas of the clinic that standard staff did not routinely enter. The asset had provided operational intelligence on 2 previous occasions, neither as significant as this, both executed without incident. This was different. This was not flagging a patient admission or confirming an identity. This was placing a physical device inside a preparation room on an object that would be handled by a dead man's family. The handler described the asset's response to the ask as calm. Considered, the asset had asked one clarifying question about the size of the device, specifically whether it would be detectable by someone running a hand along the interior of a coffin, and had received Dove's technical specifications as an answer. After reading them, the asset had said yes. What the asset had not asked, and what the handler had not volunteered, was what happened to the asset's position inside the clinic if a second review was ever conducted. If Tariq's network, in the weeks following his death, looked more carefully at the people who had come into contact with his body, if the question of whether that contact had been monitored ever moved from abstract concern to active investigation. The handler had not volunteered this because volunteering it might have changed the asset's answer, and changing the asset's answer would have ended the operation. This is the cost that the controller had seeded into the operation without fully naming it. Not the technical risk, not the signal quality, not the battery life, not the mounting surface. The human cost sitting inside a decision chain that had prioritized the operation's feasibility over the completeness of one person's understanding of their own exposure. The device was being prepared. The asset had said yes, the meeting was over. By Saturday afternoon, Dove had solved 3 of the 4 technical problems the operation required. The device housing was rebuilt and tested. The microsuction mounting panel had passed the fabric adhesion test. The battery configuration was confirmed at 60-second intervals for approximately 44 hours, enough margin if the family collected the body on Monday and the burial took place within 24 hours of that. The 4th problem he had not solved was the one he could not solve from a staging point 2 kilometers from the clinic, working with a fabric sample from a local upholstery shop. He did not know what the coffin looked like on the inside. This sounds like a minor variable. In the operational planning documents, it was framed as a minor variable, a surface condition that the microsuction panel's design accommodated across a reasonable range of materials. The panel had been designed for fabric, plastic, and light-finished wood. Dove had tested it on one of those 3. What he had not been able to test was unfinished wood with significant grain variation, raw interior surfaces with tool marks. The kind of coffin that a family might construct or source quickly, under time pressure, without the refinement of a commercially prepared casket. His technical brief had stated this clearly. He had assigned a probability range, approximately 80% adhesion confidence on smooth fabric or finished surfaces, dropping to somewhere between 45 and 60% on rough unfinished wood with significant irregularity. He had attached that range to the device transfer package. He had given it to the handler on Saturday evening. The handler had read it, understood it, and made a judgment call that was not his to make. He did not pass the probability assessment to the controller. The reason, reconstructed from subsequent debrief, was not negligence. It was operational momentum. By Saturday evening, the relay infrastructure was being assembled. The second vehicle was being positioned. The monitoring operator was at the safe house. The operation had moved from a concept in a room to a live deployment, and the handler had looked at Dove's probability range and concluded that a 45 to 60% failure scenario on the mounting surface was not a number that would change the controller's authorization. It would only introduce uncertainty that slowed execution. He may have been right. The controller, briefed on that range, might have said proceed anyway. But the controller was not briefed. He authorized a placement operation without knowing that his technical officer had built a meaningful probability of failure into the device's core assumption. Dove knew. The handler knew. The controller did not. The operation moved forward on Saturday night with a gap at its center that no one at the top of the authorization chain could see. At 2:17 on Sunday afternoon, everything the operation had been built on broke. Not the device, not the relay infrastructure, not the source, the assumption. The asset's message arrived on the handler's monitored channel and took 11 seconds to read. It contained 3 pieces of information. The family had arrived at the clinic in person. They were requesting immediate release of the body. And they had brought their own coffin. Plain wood. Unlined, no interior fabric. The handler read the message a second time. Then he looked at the time. Then he called the controller. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, the operation that had been authorized on Friday morning, prepared through Friday night and Saturday, and positioned across Beirut through Sunday morning, that operation effectively ceased to exist. Not because it had been aborted, because the conditions it had been designed for were gone. Dove's device was engineered for a fabric lining. The micro-suction panel had been tested on fabric. The adhesion confidence on smooth fabric was 80%, a number the controller had never been given, but that now became suddenly relevant, because the family's plain wooden box had no fabric at all. The relevant figure was the one at the bottom of Dove's probability range, 45 to 60% on rough, unfinished wood. A coin flip roughly on a surface no one had examined. The controller asked how long before the family completed the release paperwork. The handler said 30 to 45 minutes. The controller asked where Dove was. 2 kilometers away. No vehicle at the staging point. No prepared cover for the clinic. No reason to be there that would survive scrutiny from anyone who was paying attention. The relay car was already in position 2 blocks from the clinic. The monitoring operator was at the safe house. The second vehicle was near the Cola interchange. The entire infrastructure was live and ready to receive a signal from a device that was sitting with a technician 2 kilometers away and had been built for a coffin that no longer existed. There was a discussion about aborting. It was brief. The controller laid out the options without framing any of them as preferred. Stand down entirely, accept the loss, close the file, let the family leave. Attempt an accelerated transfer, get the device to the asset inside the clinic before the paperwork was done, with all the exposure risk that Dove walking into that building created. Abandon the coffin approach and try to attach a tracker to the family's vehicle in the loading bay, a method that would almost certainly be swept before the vehicle entered Dahieh. Or the fourth option, which the controller named last and described in the fewest words. The asset was still in the preparation room. The family was still outside. The family's coffin was in the preparation room. No one said anything for a moment. The handler said, "The asset hasn't been trained for improvisation at this level." The controller said, "I know." The handler said, "If the placement goes wrong in there, if the family finds it, if the asset makes a visible error, we lose everything. The source, the access, 2 years of clinic penetration, and we confirm to the network that the death was monitored," the controller said. "I know." The conversation did not end with a clean decision. It ended with the controller giving 2 instructions in sequence, each one conditional on the other's outcome, neither one resolving the question of what would actually happen inside a preparation room in a clinic in Hamra in the next 20 minutes. The first instruction was to get Dove to the clinic. The second was to tell the asset nothing and wait to see what the asset did. Dove did not run. Running is the thing a person does when they have decided that speed matters more than appearance. Dove had spent enough time in field environments to know that appearance was the only thing that mattered in the next 4 minutes, and that a man running toward a clinic where a Hezbollah figure's family was completing release paperwork was a problem that could not be explained away after the fact. He walked to the taxi rank at the end of the block. He waited 11 seconds for a cab to pull forward. He got in and gave an address 2 streets from the clinic, not the clinic itself, because a taxi dropping a fare at a clinic entrance during an active collection was a detail that could be reconstructed later if anyone was looking. In the cab, he took inventory of what he was carrying. The device was in the outer pocket of the bag on his lap, wrapped in a cloth that looked like a change of clothes from the outside. He had a folder of documents unrelated to the operation, acquired as general cover material, the kind of administrative paperwork a person carries when navigating a foreign hospital's bureaucratic requirements. He had no weapon. He had no backup. The relay car 2 blocks from the clinic was not positioned to assist him. It was positioned to receive a signal that the device might never transmit. He had one cover story, assembled in the taxi over 4 minutes, that he had not rehearsed and could not test before he used it. He got out 2 streets from the clinic at 2036 p.m. The side entrance Dove used was on the clinic's western face, a service access that the asset had described in a communication 10 hours earlier, during the Sunday morning confirmation window when the operation still looked like a Sunday evening placement. The door required a badge to open from outside. It did not require a badge to exit from inside, which meant it could be propped without being obviously propped, and the asset had been told, in a message sent at noon, to leave it accessible. Dove reached the door at 2039 p.m. It was closed, not propped. Closed, he stood at the door for 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time to stand at a closed door in a place you have no documented reason to be, and Dove knew it. He did not try the handle immediately. He looked at the door the way a person looks at a door when they are trying to remember which building they need, which is a look that excuses 4 seconds of stillness without creating alarm. Then he tried the handle. The door opened. The asset had not propped it. The latch mechanism had been depressed and taped from the inside, a detail so small that it read as a maintenance issue rather than an intentional adjustment. Dove registered this as he moved through the door and let it close behind him. The asset had improvised the prop without being told to improvise it, which meant the asset had been thinking ahead, which meant the asset was calm. He moved through the service corridor toward the preparation room. The lower level of the clinic was quieter than the floor above, fewer staff, narrower hallways. The specific institutional silence of a space that most of the building's personnel had no reason to enter. Dove moved at the pace of someone with somewhere specific to be, which is different from the pace of someone who is hurrying. Hurrying is visible. Purpose is invisible. He reached the junction at the corridor's midpoint at 2041 p.m. The asset was not there. The plan had been a corridor exchange. Brief, wordless, 2 people passing. The asset had been told to be at the junction at 2:40. Dove was 1 minute late. The junction was empty. He kept walking. Not because he had a backup plan for this specific failure, but because stopping at an empty junction was worse than continuing past it. He reached the end of the corridor and turned, slowly, back the way he had come. The asset appeared from a side door at 2043 p.m. Later, in the debrief, weeks afterward, the asset would explain the 2-minute delay. A family member had moved toward the preparation room ahead of schedule. A woman, older, who had separated from the group outside and walked down the administrative corridor toward the lower level before a staff member had gently redirected her back. The asset had stayed inside the preparation room until the corridor was clear. 2 minutes. It had felt, the asset said, considerably longer. The exchange took 9 seconds. Dove did not look at the asset's face. The device changed hands. He turned and walked back toward the side entrance. At 2047 p.m. he was outside. At 2051 p.m. he was in a second taxi heading away from the clinic on a route that did not retrace the one he had arrived on. He sent one message to the handler, transferred. He did not know what the asset was going to do with it. He did not know what the coffin looked like. He did not know if his device, built for fabric, was about to be pressed against a surface it had never been tested on. He sat in the taxi and waited. Inside the preparation room, the asset worked with the family's coffin for the first time at 2:49 p.m. The interior base was raw wood. Unfinished, lightly planed with grain variation that was not severe but was present, the kind of surface that a piece of furniture would have before its first coat of sealant. The asset ran a palm across it once to read the texture, the way Dove would have run a fingertip across the velvet sample in his staging room the night before. It was not the same surface. The asset knew enough about the device from the technical summary to understand what this meant. The micro-suction panel had been built for fabric. This was not fabric. Whether it would hold was not a question the asset could answer from a palm reading of an interior wooden base. The asset placed it anyway. Palm flat. Firm pressure applied across the panel's full surface for what the asset counted internally as 6 seconds, longer than instructed, because the wood grain required more uniform contact to maximize whatever suction the surface could generate. Then the palm was withdrawn. The device sat against the base. The asset pressed it a second time. 3 more seconds. Then stepped back. There was no way to test it. No way to confirm it was holding. The only test was whether the relay car 2 blocks away received a ping in the next 60 seconds, and the asset had no access to that information and no time to wait for it. The family was coming back. At 3:08 p.m., the asset sent the confirmation message. At 3:14 p.m., the handler received it and passed it to the controller with 4 words: device placed, family arriving. At 3:21 p.m., the body was being moved from the clinic's holding area to the preparation room. 3 family members and a clinic attendant. The wooden coffin was open on the preparation table. At 3:28 p.m., the relay car operator reported to the monitoring operator at the safe house. No ping received. The monitoring operator checked the frequency, checked the receiver settings, confirmed both were correct. No ping. The handler was notified at 3:29 p.m. He notified the controller at 3:30 p.m. The controller asked one question: had the family reached the preparation room yet? The handler did not know. The asset could not be contacted without creating a communication record. The relay car could not approach the clinic without breaking its cover position. There was no way to know whether the silence was because the device had failed to adhere to the wood, had shifted or fallen, or simply lost suction on an untested surface, or whether the body was still being moved and the device had not yet been sealed inside the coffin where the signal could propagate cleanly. 60 seconds passed. Then another 60. The monitoring operator was watching the receiver with the specific quality of attention that produces nothing useful, the kind of watching that doesn't accelerate the outcome, only makes the silence heavier. At 3:35 p.m., the receiver registered a ping. Clean signal. Correct frequency. Stable coordinate at the clinic's lower level. The handler told the controller. The controller said nothing for a moment. Then he told the relay car to hold position and told the monitoring operator to confirm interval consistency on the next 3 pings before anyone called it stable. The second ping arrived at 3:36 p.m. The third at 3:37 p.m. The handler exhaled. The operator wrote the coordinate into the running log. The controller, in whatever room he was in, looked at the confirmation and said nothing that was recorded. The device was transmitting. The adhesion had held on raw wood by a margin no one could quantify. The coffin was sealed. The family was loading the body into their vehicle. The operation was, for the first time since the asset's 2017 p.m. message had collapsed the original plan, proceeding, which was the moment. Exactly that moment. While the relay car noted the 3rd consecutive ping and the monitoring operator updated the route map with a stationary coordinate at the clinic's address, that the procession left the loading bay and turned in a direction no one had planned for. Not south. East. The procession did not go east by accident. That was the conclusion the controller reached within 8 minutes of the relay car's first position report, and it was a conclusion that changed what the operation meant before the operation had finished. Hezbollah's post-death protocols for senior figures did not require an active threat to activate. They were standing procedure, applied not because anyone suspected surveillance, but because the organization had learned through decades of Israeli operations against its leadership that the period immediately following a senior figure's death was operationally dangerous. Grief disrupted attention. Routine broke down. People who were usually careful became briefly careless because they were sad, and carelessness was what Israeli intelligence had historically been waiting for. The protocol's answer to this was route obfuscation. Move the body through a non-linear path. Introduce a directional diversion before entering the district. Make any surveillance vehicle maintain contact through a route change that exposed it, or lose contact entirely. The procession turned east not because Tariq's network suspected they were being followed. They turned east because Tariq's network always turned east with a body of this significance, regardless of whether they suspected anything. Which meant that 4 years of intelligence work, 4 years of trying to follow a man who expected to be followed, had been followed by an operation that had placed a device inside a coffin specifically to avoid that problem. And the problem had appeared anyway. Not because of anything Mossad had done wrong. Because the protocol existed before the operation did, and the operation had been designed without accounting for it. The relay car driver was circling his third extended loop when the procession finally turned south at 5014 p.m. He had been airborne on the signal for over an hour. His circuit had widened to the point where the ping reception was intermittent on the eastern passes, 60-second intervals producing coordinates with enough gap that the monitoring operator had twice been unable to confirm whether the procession had moved or stopped between pings. The operator had not reported those gaps in real time. He had reported aggregate position, where the device was, without flagging the moments where the signal had thinned enough that a movement could have been missed. It was a judgment call made in real time, under the operational pressure of a live tracking situation, by a person who had been told to maintain the route map and had done so as accurately as the signal allowed. The controller learned about the intermittent reception afterward. In the debrief. Not during the operation. He noted it without comment, which in the controller's documented communication style meant something between acceptance and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from recognizing that a decision you cannot reverse was made by someone acting in good faith with insufficient information. The coordinate the device transmitted from the clinic's loading bay to the southern suburb had taken 4 hours and 6 minutes to acquire. It identified a building. 6 stories. Unremarkable, no prior intelligence association of any kind. What it did not identify was which unit, which floor, how many people used the building, what it contained. The coordinate was the beginning of a second problem that was, in several respects, harder than the first. Acting on an address requires knowing the address is still valid. In the weeks following Tariq's death, his network conducted the standard security review that followed any senior figure's passing. Not because they suspected the death had been monitored, but because procedure required it. That review moved through the clinic staff as a category. It did not conclude with a finding against the asset. But it produced a document, a review record, that established that the clinic staff had been examined. If a second review was ever triggered, for any reason, the asset's name would appear in the first review's scope. And a second review finding the same name twice was a different situation than a first review finding it once. The asset understood this when the handler explained it, 1 week after the operation, during a relocation conversation that had been inevitable since the moment the family walked into the clinic on Sunday afternoon. The asset asked one question: whether the coordinate had been useful. The handler said yes. The asset nodded and did not ask anything further. The relocation was completed within 10 days. The clinic access, built over several years, maintained through careful, low-profile cultivation, productive across multiple intelligence threads that had nothing to do with Tariq, was permanently closed. Every source relationship that had flowed through that access point was either suspended or transferred to a different handling chain, with the friction and delay that any mid-chain transfer produces. The second operation, the one that would have used the coordinate to identify the specific unit and determine what it contained, was authorized. It used different assets, different methods, a different approach to a different problem. Whether it succeeded is not part of any accessible record. What is accessible is the aggregate cost. One inside position, several years in development, closed inside 10 days of an operation it had made possible. The accounting runs in one direction only. Dove received no formal commendation for his role in the operation. This was not unusual. Technical officers in support roles rarely receive the kind of recognition that goes into personnel files, but in his case, the absence was additionally specific. His technical brief had flagged the adhesion probability on unfinished wood. That brief had not been passed to the controller. The operation had proceeded on an authorization built on incomplete information, and the device had worked, despite the gap. In intelligence terms, a device that works despite an unresolved technical uncertainty is a success. The uncertainty is noted, filed, and used to improve the next iteration. Dove was consulted on the next iteration. He recommended expanding the surface testing protocol to include raw wood variants before any field deployment. The recommendation was accepted and incorporated into the technical division's standard preparation checklist. He did not recommend that probability assessments be passed to authorization level officers rather than filtered at the handler level. He understood, without needing to articulate it, that the filtering had been a judgment call and not a structural failure, that the handler had made a decision in real time that a reasonable person could have made differently, and still been wrong or right in equal measure. What he did note, in a personal document that surfaced in a later institutional review, was a single observation about the operation's most decisive moment. The moment the asset had pressed the micro-suction panel against raw wood and held it for 6 seconds instead of the instructed 3. The extra 3 seconds, unscripted, unrequested, a small adjustment made by someone in a preparation room with no guidance and no feedback, were, in his technical assessment, the most likely reason the adhesion held through 4 hours of road vibration, a loaded vehicle, and 9 stationary pings at the destination. 3 seconds. The asset's contribution was described in the controller's summary as decisive and unrequested. The asset had been relocated. The access was closed. The operation that the asset had made possible was being used to build something the asset would never see and never be told about. That is not an unusual outcome in this kind of work. It is, in fact, the most common one. What made this case specific was that the decisive contribution had not been in any plan. It had not been trained, rehearsed, or even anticipated. It had been made by one person, alone, with no information except what they could observe with their own hands, in a room where the margin for error was the difference between a 4-year intelligence gap closing and a network realizing it had been penetrated at one of its most human moments. That person's name is not in any file that is publicly accessible. The case you just watched belongs to a longer operational lineage, one built on the doctrine of passive collection through proximity. The idea that the most protected information a target carries is not in any communication, any vehicle, any device, but in the geography of their grief. The cases that developed that doctrine, tested it across different target sets and different operational environments, are not in any public file. But some of them are in what we put together in the ebook in the description below. The ebook covers the operational record of proximity-based collection, the methods, the case failures that refined them, and the specific decisions that separated the operations that produced intelligence from the ones that produced only exposure. The link is in the description.